got
right?
Peter's here.
All right, so I'm Jose. I'm filling in for Peter this week. He's in, if you, like Mike just said, he's in London for the Historical Materialism conference. So he asked me to come in, and the way I frame it is to come help lead a discussion about Gramsci in the context of Marxism and democracy, right? So first off, how do I know these people? I know Michael and Peter because I work with Peter at BMCC. We're actually in the same office. I'm not the same discipline as him though. He's a political scientist. He'd probably take offense to me him calling him that. He likes to be called a thinker. He almost punched me. But I got trained up, at least from a graduate education, in philosophy. And my philosophical interests are in Plato and Nietzsche, and all of a sudden red flags should go up, right? You're like, well, Plato and Nietzsche, right? Must be some authoritarian type. Could be. No, but I just find those very interesting, and I don't know why. Maybe it's some sort of libidinal reasons I like those guys. But beyond that, how I have a sort of entree into Marxism is through the work of Frantz Fanon. And in part, my dissertation was about him and his work. So I guess on that end, that's what I'm sort of bringing to the table in terms of my background. I didn't study philosophy as an undergrad, though. I went to Fordham and I got a degree in Latin American studies, Latin American Latino studies and fine arts. So it was much later I got corrupted by philosophy. I actually hated philosophy when I first learned about it. It was terrible. It was hard to understand, right? So it still is, but I guess I like it now, right? So that's where I'm coming from. And so, like I said, I think in some sense, because I haven't been coming, right, and you guys have a little bit of background on what's been going on, I figure that this is just as much as a collaboration of me learning from you about what you've discussed, and me, I guess, offering some insight about Gramsci if that's possible, right? So I guess the first thing is this, is that where do you guys think we're at in terms of the discussion of Marxism and democracy? Just sort of like quick and dirty version, where's your feeling? Where are you coming from, where we're going? All right. Some sense I want to get a sense of the situation we're in, the context we're in.
I mean, maybe I can help frame it.
Yeah,
Peter began with a reading of Castiaradas on the polis and democracy,
Yes.
which is a kind of recasting of Aristotle's politics in a Marxist light, and very interesting on what it means to be a citizen and what does the demos and the deans actually mean in this context, and what relationship would this have to a future good society, and how do we begin to construct this and look forward. So that was the beginning of the readings in this course. Really began with what Peter considers himself, I guess, if the label could be applied, was the beginning of Aristotelian Marxism, if you will, and Castiaradas being the major figure there. I think the book was what, the invention of democracy? Was it from Castiaradas?
Is that the series of essays?
Yeah, it's essays on the polis, and he used chapter 5 in particular.
It's a very good reading.
Yeah, very interesting.
Polis and the beginning of democracy.
Really, yeah.
So talking
On
about
Greek
the
polis.
constituting, how Athenians thought of themselves as constituting themselves, right?
Yes,
Right.
and what does it mean to be an actual citizen? What does citizenship really mean? And,
That-
how does this relate? Yeah, please, Richard.
Oh, just the
Yeah.
mistranslation of polis as state.
Yes.
Yeah.
So then the Jewish question and how Marx is, challenging the idea that the state is something that's transhistorical, and Castoriadis is kind of, corroborating this through his own, pointing out that polis, translating it as state, kind of creates this false idea, as you just said, Jose, that in fact the polis is really in the people.
So excellent, cool. All right, so basically the starting point is sort of, what does it mean to be democracy? This sort of the ancient tradition. It means to constitute ourselves in some sense, right? The
Right.
active
Right.
process that never.
Other readings,
Yeah.
other readings that we've been doing are also Critique of the Gotha program, the philosophical, economic and philosophical manuscripts.
Well, we did that.
Oh,
in
that was, I
philosophy.
get
It's okay.
confused,
No,
okay.
you know, similar.
And Luxembourg,
Yeah.
Reform and Revolution, and her piece on the Russian Revolution, and, and Panicock, worker councils.
Right.
That was last week, yeah.
Right. And, I mean, the critique, obviously, as you would know, is the critique of social democracy that Luxembourg engages in, and how that's related to the earlier Gotha program of Marx, you know, when they did the critique of the Gotha program, you know, that, you know, really framed in, you know, I think the course is kind of framed as, is there a revolutionary democracy, right, in a sense? Where are we going in terms of radical democracy? That reformism is always an enemy, a main antagonist, and, you know, how do we, you know, think beyond this notion, you know, through Luxembourg, through Panicock and the workers' councils, through Marx, of course, and the Jewish question and the critique of the Gotha program, and now, of course, through Gramsci, who's not, in my opinion, a reformist, although, you know, we can talk about, you know, passive revolution and some of the things that he deals with that sometimes lean that way, you know, and he's been accused of such. Yeah.
All right. So I guess Marx, Luxembourg, and Panicock are more considered as critiques of this reformism, this sort of incrementalism. Is that sort of the approach taken so far? And then now we're at Gramsci. Is that sort of the leap we've made?
Yeah, the leap is to Gramsci from,
Okay.
and last week there was also an analysis of Sartre's Election Trap for Fools, you know, what electoral politics, the limitations of electrical
Serialization.
politics, and what does serialization mean, even though, you know, we didn't really get into the philosophical background of serial thinking, you know, from the critique of dialectical reason, but how Sartre uses it in this little short occasional piece of 1971.
All right. So I guess we could just jump into Gramsci now, I suppose.
Yes.
So I guess how we're framing this discussion. Well, he's framing it as how do we read the Prince in the context of now, right? I think that's pretty straightforward. And me, this is interesting because I don't have a background, an undergraduate background in political philosophy. I'd never read The Prince before, right? And so for me, I've heard weird things about it, right? It's always been a mixed bag. It's been either something from along the lines of it's a waste of your time to even open, to it's the most fundamental thing you should ever read, right?
I agree with the latter.
But here's the thing.
I don't want to prejudice.
Here's the thing, and what's
Yeah.
interesting is that, and this goes to maybe some points he's implicitly making, is that the people that I've heard that it's not good to read it from think political science is not that big of a deal,
I see.
right? So they think, no, what? Who cares about the Prince? Political science is a joke anyway, right? They
Well,
think
probably
it's-
Machiavelli would think the same way about political science, yeah.
right? But it's interesting that it's coming from that perspective, especially when later on he's giving the critique of sociology, right? So what's he say? What's going on with the Prince? I suppose.
Could I frame something?
Yeah,
Because,
please,
historically,
please.
it's interesting that The Prince is composed in 1513. It's basically a book that is a job interview. It's like a long resume that he is presenting to Lorenzo de' Medici, you know, because he needs a job. He's broke. He's out of favor with everybody. So he writes this. He has a beautiful introduction to Lorenzo of giving a gift of historical significance as well as practical advice. A very beautiful introduction that he has there. The interesting thing about the period is that in 1513, you know, slavery is justified by thinkers in the church. Oh, I'm sorry about that. You can just, I'm sorry, my phone. Anyway, you can look at this. Savonarola, who was a contemporary of Machiavelli, is arguing against slavery, but the tendency is to justifies slavery on Aristotle saying some are slaves by nature.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And this becomes a very dominant moment during the Atlantic slave trade. Okay, 1516 comes around and Sir Thomas More writes Utopia, the first modern utopic speculation, right? And Catharsis writes The Devastation of the Indies. So these are three texts that I think are very crucial in terms of the beginning of mercantile capitalism and its ascendancy and the light manufacturing era of capital. So for me, it's an incredibly significant book because in one way it's not a utopian book. On another way, it's a kind of manifesto about power. How do you get it? How do you maintain it? And how do you increase it? You know, it could be retitled probably instead of The Prince Power. Maintenance, you know.
It's a treatise
Sounds very
on
much in line with
realpolitik,
Gramsci.
right?
Yeah. So,
Right.
anyway, again, just to give that background, I think that's one of the reasons it's obviously a classic in Italian literature, and, Machiavelli is Florentine, meaning that he's elite Italian. The Florentians don't really speak to the rest of Italy. They have their nose way up, that's another thing. Tuscany and Florence being a very different region. And, and the book is burned. It's burned multiple times, it's put on indexes, etc. So the book, The Prince itself, has a very long history of, subterfuge, misinterpretation, various interpretations, and is a book read everywhere from the Pentagon, required reading for the U.S. Marine Corps, to, academics such as us, and practical revolutionaries like Gramsci. So I just wanted to, it gives, I think, just a kind of context for where he's coming from here in terms of rethinking this. But to me, the interesting thing, utopia is positioned at the same time as a realpolitik in the strongest sense of the word during this period.
He talks about Cesare Borgias, doesn't he?
Yeah, well, Cesare Borgias, one example.
One of his,
Yeah, and the de Medici family, alongside the Rothschilds, run Europe. They're basically the class that runs Europe. For so many years. So he is the advisor to the dominant, house of ruling class of all of Europe during this period. Who were so smart they got princes alongside of popes. The ecclesiastical state worked with the state itself, something we Greeks never thought through. We were always underground.
They were they were arch plotters and schemers. Along
Right,
with the good things.
Yeah. So anyway, I'll desist now.
No.
Yeah.
Because I guess I have a question for you in some sense.
Yeah.
It's what you're describing is the economic corporative situation in Italy at that time, right?
In a lot of ways. So he was. He was.
Right, we've got these
Yeah.
people who have these shared interests because they're in a
Right.
particular trade or an industry, right? And that's the
Well,
extent.
this was the ruling family, not just people in
Oh, no,
trade
but that,
or
in terms of
whatever.
how to describe the relationships going on at that time historically,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Right?
Sure.
So my perspective on that, the history of the Eastern Mediterranean, comes from Molly Green, who wrote a book called Italian Pirates, Greek Merchants.
Mhm.
So it's a bit broader than just.
I thought the Greeks were the pirates.
No,
Yeah,
Italians
okay,
are
the
the pirates.
inversion.
I can't hear what
Greeks
she
were
said.
merchants.
Italian,
No, just the reverse.
Italian
reverse.
pirates, Greek merchants.
Well,
Oh boy, what an insult to the Greeks. I'm sorry.
No, the sea captains in the Eastern Mediterranean
Yeah.
were the brokers for the merchandise
I
on
see,
their ships,
I see,
like
okay.
from Egypt to Constantinople.
I see.
And their goods were pirated.
Okay, what's her name
by the
again?
Catholics.
Molly Green?
She's at Princeton.
Okay, good, okay, all right. Okay.
It's sort of broad, and it gives you a broader historical perspective on it.
But the Genoans and the Lombards were also all over Europe, especially the Genovese.
They were
Right.
The Wall Street of London is called Lombard Street
They were.
Yes.
because of the Lombards.
Lombards,
Let
that's
me
correct.
ask you also, and maybe this is getting into too much detail, and not to suggest for a moment you don't know the answer, but but I was thinking about this book by Giovanni Arrighi
Yeah.
about
Long Century?
Yeah.
or-
The Long
Yeah, I
Century,
read it.
Finance, Capital,
It's
and
an
everything.
excellent book.
When Machiavelli is involved here, is it still? I mean, is it still like they're doing real business? Are they merchants, or are they gotten to the point where it's like Goldman Sachs and they're trading? You know, and it's or is the ruling family actually involved in just circulating money, or are they actually doing
Money laundering.
Are they actually trading things back and forth in the time?
Well,
that
I think
the
they
prince is
control, I
involved?
mean, I think the title of the book is kind of indicative of this. I mean, they're working through mercantile relations.
Right,
We're not
okay.
on the era, we're really in the light manufacturing
Right,
phase of capital
okay.
that has not really hit the manufacturing phase or the industrial,
mercantile.
capital yet.
Got it.
So you're still dealing with merchant capital during this period. I mean, the interesting thing again is, and I mean, you're a film, Rossellini made a classic
Right.
film about the De Medicis, a historical film about this group of people, and they're very much forgotten about how influential and how much they actually controlled. This was not only about economic corporatist power. I think it was much more about the ability to manipulate, nation states, to manipulate church-states relations to the point of where this became the term Machiavellian even sort of came from this, in a way, which has very bad connotations. I mean, this is something that people have
Right.
tried to, and going back to Jose's own interest, Nietzsche himself wanted to write a treatise. This was Nietzsche's last ambition. The Will to Power was the beginning of a treatise based on Machiavellian politics.
Yeah.
This is a very interesting moment that Nietzsche and Machiavelli, Nietzsche had this relationship to Machiavelli very late.
Well, I mean, I can see what I've been reading.
Yeah,
If it's about
yeah.
leadership, Nietzsche has a
Yeah.
very distinct interest in that.
Right,
so
right,
That's
right.
not surprising at
Yeah,
all.
yeah.
So wait a second. So I guess to frame the historical context, to get it in terms of Gramsci, this is a serious time of disequilibrium in the world, right?
Yes,
Which means
sure.
that these people can go spread their ideologies and try to become hegemons in some sense.
Right.
Right? Cultural influence beyond just the military, right?
Right.
And financial. So that's interesting. That actually is a nice way to frame this whole context because, I was thinking,
And the formation of the nation state.
oh, of course,
The
of
book
course, of
is
course.
really about the unification of Italy.
Yeah.
That's what The Prince is really about.
I got you, I
It's
got you.
trying to unify Italy, but, I'm sorry about this. I got a crazy person on my hands. Sorry, thank you.
All right, so I guess the first big takeaway in terms of the modern Prince is something like this: is that we don't have. All right, let's put it this way: it's not a treatise in the sense of telling us how to do politics in this sort of discrete list of rules, and if you follow this approach, you're going to end up with this result, right? It's much more along the lines of providing a model through a leader and something that people can identify with easily, right? And so on that end, the Prince itself just becomes sort of a placeholder for an ideology, right? And so how does it transform? We don't live with princes and kings anymore, right? The prince transforms in our era, at least according to Gramsci, to the party, right? And so that's going to be the placeholder for these values, these intellectual and moral values, right? But here's the thing, and I think this is what's really interesting, and this is what sort of, it always reminds me of Fox News and sort of how the right wing is sort of got this really lock on providing a narrative that fills up a story for these people's minds and gives them values to follow and things to identify with, right? And that's what Gramsci seems to be pointing about the Prince, about Machiavelli, right? Is that when it's the case that you're developing this image, you're developing in a dramatic manner, right? Which appeals to people's passions, right? Which is easy for them to follow and understand. Right? And so in the context of how to understand the party and in developing its, modern day Prince, that's how we'd have to talk about it in a dramatic sense. The content, the program, would through the drama. All right? And I think, like I said, I think it's easy to see when we think about how the right wing has sort of this lock on delivering us a narrative of a person like Trump. All right?
He's our prince.
What?
He's our prince.
Yeah, in many senses.
You can speak for
But here's the
yourself.
thing.
He has become.
Yeah, no, that's the interesting thing, though, because here's the
Occupying
thing.
the office of the prince.
Because think about this, what the narrative is supposed to talk about is the party itself, and what do we get the narrative now? Is that Trump and the Republican Party are one thing now, right? And so in many ways, I mean, it's unfortunate to talk about it this way, many of the qualities he seems to talk about seem to be on the right, in some sense, already active in some sense. This cohesion, this sense about themselves, right? This sense that the party is above everything else, right? So it's almost as if those people read the Prince themselves and they're trying to apply it.
Tories are.
Well, yeah, they've
Right.
read the Prince.
That's the key,
In their
that's the
way,
key.
that's correct.
No, but that's the whole thing,
Yeah,
though.
they don't read the Prince as a revolutionary manifesto, they
No.
use it as a manifesto for their own purposes, and they use it, yes. And you can see this on TV, I mean, Game of Thrones, you know, you can see all these cultural items that are very much out of this Machiavellian moment that have become very much part of TV series and Netflix and all this kind of stuff that's going on in terms of the ideological, you know, mediatic apparatus that you just were alongside of Fox.
Yeah, because I mean, ultimately,
Yeah.
what it's doing, and this is, I think, what, something that Peter suggested that we discuss, is this idea is the party as the educator.
Yes.
Right? Ultimately, what is the role of the party in terms of relating to the masses and sort of providing a program, right? It's about educating the people, providing moral and intellectual content to their understanding of the world, all right? And so, I guess, in some sense, I'd like to hear from you in some sense, what you think that might look like, and what does it mean for the party to be an educator, right? Because, I mean, there's a lot of this stuff in here about analysis, about understanding the past, having foresight and all that, right? But when we think about what it is the party is supposed to do, especially in the context of it being organic, all right? How is the party supposed to be an educator when it seems to be the case, all right? Or maybe I'm just full of mystifications, delusions, that there doesn't seem to be this sort of collective will for that kind of education in the first place, all right? It seems that the seeds of that kind of foment aren't there in some sense, right? Isn't that the case with at least I'm an educator, right? When I walk into the classroom, I don't feel the seeds of foment there ready to just crawl over and think, oh man, these people are ready to be directed towards a party and be educated a certain way. In fact, it seems like it's the opposite that's happening, right? Or if it's the case they do identify, they're identifying with some reactionary stuff.
Well, in some ways, I don't think the party is a concrete reality either for, I mean, in Gramsci's case, there is the
No,
Communist
but I mean,
Party,
so
but
according-
for
but-
us today, in
I got
terms of
you.
a Gramscian moment, the party is an abstraction, but it's the educational, agitational, you know, educational activity that is really the party. This is the organism that people speak of for Gramsci, because we have no organization, we have no, you know, I mean, you have DSA and you have ISO
No, but
and
that's
all
what I'm-
these groups, but, you know.
But here's the thing, I would
that's
say
fine.
this though, right, is that especially, because
Yeah.
he says stuff like newspapers are parties, right?
Yes,
Or at
exactly.
least fractions
Yeah,
of these
yeah,
parties,
exactly.
right? And so,
Yeah.
we don't have to talk about education as being educated, we
Right,
could talk about
right.
just the cultural transmission of things,
Right,
right?
exactly,
And
yeah.
so, and again, it just makes me feel depressed in some senses. Right, has really got a lock on sort of how to
We're
habituate
looking
people
forward to
a
an
certain-
essay for situations on being depressed in the
You
education.
know, I think that the right understands power,
Yeah.
and I think the right understands that the truth is not about finger-waving moralism. The truth is what you say it is. The truth is performative.
Right.
You know, the truth occurs in its construction, and that's what the right understands. So then when we get fake news, the Democrats come along saying, oh, you know, that was an untruth. We're going to tell the masses, and they're going to understand that he's a liar. Actually, he's doing a fantastic job
Right.
Oh, no,
creating
that's why I'm
truths,
depressed.
which we should be. What?
We should be doing that.
We should be
no,
Yeah,
creating
and the interesting thing
truths.
about Gramsci, he talks about this modern prince as a myth.
Yes.
He begins with Sorel's myth of the
Yep.
general strike
Yep.
and the syndicalist moment, right? And he, you know, this is what the left cannot do.
Yes.
Cannot build myths.
That's
There's no
right.
myth making going on.
That's
No, I mean,
right.
because here's the thing, you
We're
can think
too
about it in terms of
individualistic.
the rhetoric, it's like,
Maybe so.
what's sort of the standard thing to say? It's like, well, these people are just voting against their self-interest. It's like, oh, wait a second, why are we assuming that they're rational or they're going to respond to that in the first place?
That's true.
Right? The right center certainly doesn't think that way.
Oh, they might say,
Right.
who the hell are you to tell me what
That's
my
exactly it,
self-interest
right?
is to begin
But in
with?
this case, they would have been voting for their material self-interest in terms of what was on offer from the Democrats, who in 2008 said, we're going to give you card check. Where did they get card check? No. Who said, we're going to give you a jobs program? Did they get a jobs program? I mean, if you read interviews with the factory workers who voted, to the extent there are factory workers anymore who voted Trump, that's what they say. I mean, if there had been the most anemic jobs program, we wouldn't have a Trump. I think they voted for their self-interest.
Also, society of the spectacle. You know, I think it's the use of spectacle, and this is always, or there's often a debate about. You know, I mean, I think one kind of thinking often is just do it. You know, and in fact, it's not just enough to do it. You also have to, or the argument is also made that you have to give people, you know, an interpretive set of concepts. Otherwise, the action, whatever action you do, I mean, I'm working right now on a film about the League of Revolutionary Black Workers back in the end of the '60s,
Cool.
and you know, one of the things is they really, you know, they're all for doing things. You know,
Just
they have
heard
two
the
wildcat
news.
strikes, but they and you know this and the rebellion of '67. But they really realize, and then they start like an extended book club, for example, and they make a film because they realize you have to give people, you know, and give them an interpretive framework. You know, you
Yeah.
have to, as is in one of the bathrooms with Angela Davis there, but you have to also change minds.
Right,
Yeah.
right, I saw
So
that.
and that's not always, people don't always agree with that. You know, some people feel that's a waste of time. You know, you just do it. Again, to quote, not by chance, Nike sneakers. But, you know, versus giving people a kind of, not to use too highfalutin a term, theoretical apparatus or a way of, and what Michael was just saying, and what you were just saying, Jose, made me aware of is, of course, you know, the prince is a character. It's a way of, you know, it's a person. You know, he's giving it. It's not by chance he's giving it in a dramatic, structure.
All right, so here's the thing, to piggyback off what you pointed out, and in terms of, I guess, what's already been going on, is that we already have an interpretive framework, or at least it's dominating things, and I think it's the economistic understanding that he was trying to draw out,
Yeah.
right? Which is the idea that everything is about self-interest, right? And that's sort of the motivating factor for underlying everything, right? Now, that, and then there's a couple other issues that was brought up, the construction of truth, and then the issue of spectacle, right? And it seems to me, at least from Gramsci's perspective, those are occasional events, all right? Those aren't self-sustaining. They cannot be things that are organic and going to sustain itself for the future development of things, right? However, and this is really important though, those sorts of things do serve to keep the equilibrium of what's going on in this system that we have already, though, right? But again, like I said, those are occasional. Those aren't organic changes that are going to allow for the change of the future. All right. Let's see.
In other words, those are like, they come and go.
Yeah.
They're not going to give you that long runway you need for a large.
Yeah. Let's put it this way:
change.
it's like you're planting seeds with the organic. Just think of like organic vegetables. You're planting seeds in a nice way for the future, and not just for one harvest, but for harvest and hopefully indefinitely, right? With these occasional things, they're just popping up and you're harvesting and taking without any consideration for the future, all right? And so, but for him, that's really important to distinguish, all right? Because his occasional stuff, while it's important to examine, right, what we need to focus on and find are those things that are organic and sustaining, right? Because that's what we need to latch onto in terms of, I guess, identifying what he would call collective will, right? Let's see here. All right, do you have any questions so far, or?
Just like to go.
What page are you on now?
Oh, I got a different,
Yeah, I'd just like to go back.
Oh.
It's about, just a quote of, it's the brief notes on Machiavelli's politics.
yeah.
And it's the, since you have a different edition, it's about the 5th paragraph, which begins, "The modern prince, the
Yep.
myth prince."
yeah.
Yeah, page 129 in the selected prison
Brief note,
notebooks.
129.
The modern prince, the myth prince, cannot be a real person, a concrete individual. It can only be an organism, a complex element of society in which a collective will, which you mentioned, which has already been recognized and has to some extent asserted itself in action, begins to take concrete form. History has already provided this organism, and it is the political party, the first cell in which they come together germs of a collective will tending to become universal and total. In the modern world, only those historical or historico-political actions which are immediate and imminent, characterized by the necessity for lightning speed, can be incarnated mythically by a concrete individual. I think this is where this Trump and the right
Exactly.
is really about.
Melding into
Such
one,
speed
right?
can only be made necessary by a great and imminent danger. A great danger and annihilates the critical, fear of a black planet,
Yeah,
so to
exactly.
speak, an imminent danger, of which Trump, was partially, elected on. I mean, in some ways. Yeah. Fanaticism suddenly to white heat and annihilates the critical sense and corrosive. So again, the prince is not to be, individualized or anthropomorphized. It's really a very complex organism of which the party is the fundamental, appendage, right, in a sense. And then, of course, it has its figures, as we know, in a way. And I think this is very akin to kind of a symptomatic reading of a Lacan, et cetera, or an Althusser, that you're beginning to see where they get this from, in terms of the Gramscian moment, especially Althusser, in my view, So anyway, I just wanted to point this out, that, Gramsci uses, terms from biology like organism to describe this complex called, quote unquote, the party and also the modern state in many ways, right? And then, there's so much on myth here. I forgot, when I was looking this over again, how much he devotes to the problem of myth and myth making, which is something the left has never really even written a book on. It's amazing. Lyotard, in a book called Le Différent, begins with, here's the myth of, this thing. He starts a new kind of narrative, but the left has never really engaged this at all.
And that's funny.
You have revolutionary heroes, but no myths around this. The last myth is the general strike in Sorel, or the Russian Revolution in a certain way, the 10 days that shook the world.
Yeah.
No, it's
You're
interesting.
writing
I
from
read
there.
that finally.
Just a thought.
Very few artists really on the left in some ways. So you have sort of
Right.
a liberal artist that seems predominant, but very
Right.
few people that actually take up revolutionary politics
Right.
as the people who would make ththese myths.
Yes, that's another thing. Yeah.
And sometimes you see it in
No,
film,
that's true.
but only in rare instances. And then since the late the 60s and 70s, a regression basically
Right.
back to sort of mass forms
Right.
of film.
Right.
There was the Diego Rivera, and his
Yeah,
great
I was-
murals
Sure,
were
yeah.
up in
Yeah, of
Radio
course.
City when I was
And
a kid.
Siqueiros
And then they
and,
were taken down.
yeah.
But for a long time, we haven't really,
They were great.
theorized
They were
an art
great.
on the left.
Right. But, and brought to you by philanthropy, though.
Yeah, exactly.
They were not
Exactly.
brought to you by the working class. They were brought to you by Henry Ford and company.
I wonder where they are
Speaking of
now.
the UAW in Detroit.
And this is something that's really
Right.
important in Nietzsche too, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's
Yeah.
the artist that makes the myth.
Of course, they create
Right.
values.
We have nothing.
Yeah, the necessary illusions, as
Yeah.
Nietzsche used to call art, a necessary illusion.
And artists started Occupy Wall Street. Those activists were mostly all
Yeah,
artists.
that's right.
Well,
What's
this
that?
is
I'm
really
sorry?
interesting.
I said artists started Occupy Wall Street. Most
Right,
of those
right.
activists were artists. who
Yeah.
decided where, I mean, Zuccotti Park wasn't the first, their prime
Right.
location, it was other, who decided where to occupy and why and how to proceed.
And
They
just-
were mostly artists.
And in terms of society, the spectacle, one thing that really struck me about Occupy Wall Street, it was like a TV studio. In other words, half the people down there had cell phones, and it was a very small space. But, again, it was just it was very smart in terms of it could go out so quickly. It was a very early and powerful use of, a spectatorship that got away from,
And that was its flaw, right? Because as we just said, it had no launch, no runway for,
right,
For
for
the real
something
movement.
longer, more.
yeah.
And it's, this is really interesting to me just because, like I said, I have an interest in Plato, and if you read the Republic, what's one of the first lessons you learn? It's like, you gotta tell the people a noble lie.
The noble
Yeah.
lie.
You gotta tell them a myth. You gotta convince the average
myth of the
person
metals.
that this is the way the world is, and they gotta accept it, and they think, okay. And what's that mean by Gramsci? It's just that we gotta get consent somehow, right? And it doesn't seem to be the case, and I think he's very clear about this, is that you can't get consent of the average person, of the masses, through a set of principles that are just laid out in a form of logic. Right? That doesn't seem to appeal to people. Right? I don't know why, and I teach logic. I love logic, right? And like it appeals to me, right? But that obviously, it explains why it's the case that, when I am teaching logic, the faces are like this. Right? Why? Because it isn't inciting any passion. It isn't inciting any sort of active awareness on their part to think, oh man, this is something I want to attach to and consent to, and give my will to in some sense. So yeah, again, I think it is a disappointment, as you point out, that there isn't any sort of revolutionary myth makers, right? Who make it their point to be like, I'm gonna tell the story of the left in a way that gives them heroes to look at, and they can obviously identify with, and not have any mistakes about it, not be unclear about.
But it's not so easy though,
Yeah.
because once you bring structure, like structuralism, into the question, you decenter, the individual as an artist or as a myth maker in a sense. Like then you have all of these different problems that make it incredibly difficult to sort of just enunciate one single form of a myth that appeals to a common person, And then you sort of devolve into identity politics ultimately.
Yeah.
And that's where we are.
Yeah. But I mean, here's the thing, and I guess, unfortunately, we've got all kinds of examples of how it is effective on the right, right? Because in some sense, they
But it's
developed a
reductionistic.
myth around the
Yeah.
Republican Party and attached Donald Trump to it, and then, again, people have a story about that guy that's easily identifiable and easily to work out with.
Well, the myth is, the Wild West show, the individual,
Yeah. And he's an
strong
instantiation of that,
masculinist
right?
tendencies.
Norm-
All
That's
of these
found in
things
the
are myths
Republican
that,
Party,
that are
right?
very deeply ingrained in American, culture and life, that are played upon in the sense of everything from sports culture
Right.
to cinema, and
Right.
action films, et cetera, et
Oh,
cetera.
Bush and
So there's
Clinton
this
said,
constant
"Watch my new."
reinforcement of this reductionism that's
24/7.
going on,
Well,
right?
The,
I mean,
the left needs to have a calendar comparable to Norman Rockwell. Did you ever see a Norman?
I don't like that.
Norman-
We gotta do better than Norman Rockwell. Then we don't have a need for a left.
Norman
We're only
Rockwell,
repeating Norman
all of
Rockwell.
those one-dimensional
Right.
paper paste.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Well,
We need something
Yeah.
comparable.
Maybe so. Maybe
you know,
something
we
simple.
have like only one leader and we feel identified to one leader. But what about many leaders together and many identities together? Because I don't know, I feel that the minorities now are coming together and people are just coming, I don't know, like feel that the identification, feel
That's
the struggle
important.
together. And
All the
with this
women.
Trump, I feel like it's only few, just a part of it, but there is something left, behind. So
Yep.
I don't know.
Yeah, and I think you can do something other than the model identity. I think you can have a model of subjectivity, which involves on the part of the audience you elicit a productive capacity. So you're not just putting people in a kind of a roller coaster and they're totally passive as they are in a Hollywood film, but you're actually getting them to kind of make their own meaning and as you can do with Machiavelli's The Prince, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to kind of create, works of art that, again, elicit the productive capacity of audience members to make meaning, which hasn't been necessarily reduced and already, regurgitated the way it is in a Hollywood
Mhm.
film in many ways.
Perhaps the word legendary would be, or legend would be useful at this point from
Mhm.
listening to you. I mean, a legend is something other than or before than the myth. And we could think of Emma Gonzalez's speeches after the Parkland shooting as sort of legendary moments in student
Yeah.
high school activism, for instance.
I mean, this is
Yeah.
my point too about this. After the 60s and 70s in film, like for me, Godard and the Zig Vertov group or something, where there were specific instances where that relationship, I think, was called out, which I
Right.
think, in Walter Benjamin, he sort of relates that to sort of the relationship of theater to the
Right.
audience,
An
where you
allegory,
co-constitute.
allegory,
And that's sort of the relationship that film sort of had at that point, it seems to me.
Mm.
But I don't know where that is today. Like, I don't know where that...
And the other thing is what stimulates the imagination, not only myth, but say the children who are suing the federal government because of climate change,
Yeah.
right? This is something that will, we're talking about the radical imagination, we're at the
Mhm,
table
mhm.
of the
I
radical
like children
imagination.
filing
Right,
suits, yeah.
Right. So what, it's not only the myth that can stimulate
Right.
action or quell it, depress it, but also other things can stimulate the imagination.
Philosophy for children.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I understand. I mean, the reason I wanted to, when we speak about Gramsci, we're going to speak hegemony, war of position, war of maneuver, all these kind of terms. And this is a very under-theorized moment. I mean, for our
Okay.
purposes in this class, to look
Okay,
at something such as
I just
myth.
feel like everyone's
That's why,
mired in
I
Trumpism
just
right
kind
now.
of went to it. Yeah, no, I
Yeah,
mean, in
that's
a
why
way,
I'm
and I
saying
think
something else,
Jose
yeah.
knows very well that myth has played out in the history of philosophy in many, many ways, from Plato to Nietzsche in many ways, and also on the left, in a sense, the myth of the prolecult, was another thing that played out. Nietzsche had an active role in Soviet Russia in some ways with the Übermensch, the myth of the Übermensch, which is a right-wing, take at some levels of the Aryan soldier, but at the same time the left appropriated and talked about this. We don't really talk this way anymore, and this was something that was around, the Soviet Union and Soviet formalism, of that period. So I think it's important
It explains a lot,
to
but not everything.
What's that? I'm sorry.
I think it explains a lot, but not everything.
Yeah,
about the
no,
moment.
I don't think
That's all.
everything, no, I just think it's again, from my standpoint, it's a very under-theorized,
Okay.
part about, Marxism and myth. Marcuse, for example, in Eros and Civilization, will speak about two myths. The myths of Narcissus, right, and the myth of Orpheus. And Orpheus becomes a myth on which the new left tries to found itself, the poet, liberator, the song, etc. It's really a kind of new revolutionary spirit. But he's the only one of the, quote, pantheon of theorists that really goes to this level and talks about. Adorno never talks about myth. Horkheimer doesn't talk about myth. Forget it with Althusser or, Lenin and, other people like that. So this is the only thing I'm trying to, what, I'm sorry?
No,
Yeah,
Althusser
yeah.
and myth.
Yeah. No. Yeah, so, that's the only reason I wanted to kind of go there. And going back to structuralism, Levi-Strauss writes this brilliant, study of myths. It's a structural mythology. It's beautiful, but it's structural, right? It's without agency.
Right.
And this is the amazing thing, that myth is studied from a structuralist perspective, but without agency. So
Yeah.
again, our task is to say, is there myth alongside
And sort of as
of
destiny.
agency? Jose's opening question. I teach all these people, they're dispassionate about logic, they're dispassionate about anything. How do you set fire in the belly? How do you put fire back in the eyes? What do you do in this context?
Pre-existing conditions.
Yeah, pre-existing. Oh, is that what she was doing? She was waving her hand.
That set 'em on
Nancy
fire.
Pelosi, everybody's citing Nancy. That's going to set them on fire.
Set 'em right on
Pre-existing conditions. Who
Yeah.
doesn't have one of those?
Actually, maybe part of it is that this sort of economist, scientific, strict scientific perspective, sort of this brute empiricism that we walk around with, at least
Yeah,
generally,
good point.
has really infiltrated our ability to respond to myths. So the example I have
Good
is
point.
this: is that I'm teaching a course right now on violence, and we read René Girard's a section of On the Sacred and Violence.
Violence in the sacred, yeah.
Yeah, that's what it is. That's what it is.
A course
And-
on what?
Violence, and
Oh.
you read the French theorist René Girard
And so,
on violence in the sacred. Yeah.
There's a part where it brings up the myth of Ajax and him going crazy because he got pissed off about not getting Achilles' shield, and so he went and killed a bunch of what he thought were people who were actually lambs that we use for sacrifice typically. So Girard says something like, well, in this case, it's actually a lesson for the Greek people to say that there are limits to what is a good sacrifice and not, and if you do bad sacrifice, you're a mad person like Ajax. So the student says, I don't like that story. Why is he telling us myths and stuff like that? Why doesn't he just sort of give the argument as to why it's the case that sacrifice and violence are related, right? And so, in some sense, us coming up in this scientific world, focused on objectivity, sort of primed us to think, no, I don't want to respond to myth, right? I don't think it's a good way of thinking about the world. Even though it's the case, I would say, at least outside the classroom, that student probably loves movies, is probably involved in all kinds of stuff that sort of drops his mind and lets him think, in some sense, mythically, right? But it's not that obvious connection to having a program built into that myth. If anything, when you watch these movies and stuff, the program is more individuation, right? More separation.
Yeah,
right?
that's totally like the Black Panther movie. It was a de-education of black people about their power, political power.
I wasn't the only one. 'Cause everybody was- No, for real.
No, you're good company here. Doesn't Muthian in ancient Greek means to begin, right? Myth comes from the verb to begin, right?
Or story,
Or
arcane.
story.
I think
Does
you
it
think
mean-
like
does the
arcane
word
power
myth
It's
or-
kind of a beginning, right?
Yeah,
though?
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
it has the
sort of
notion of the beginning, the commencement.
Yeah.
right?
Doesn't it mean meaning? Doesn't mythos mean meaning?
No,
I don't know.
I don't know.
No.
It doesn't mean
No, no,
meaning.
No, more story,
what
but
does it mean?
beginning,
More story.
commencement
Yeah.
and beginning.
Oh, all right.
You know, it's like arche is both beginning,
Oh,
principle, and
Yeah,
command.
Foundation.
Yeah,
power,
foundation,
yeah.
yeah, power, yeah.
Rule.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but that's
Yeah.
but that's the sort of the point is that
Yeah.
you need this sort of guiding principles built into the myth,
Right.
that aren't being punched into your face, right? That are easy to sort of pick up in it, right? And so it reminds me of how people study the Greeks historically, which is to say that, hey, we think their myths are stupid, but for them they were an educational thing. They would see that and identify with and learn about themselves and their culture and the structure of the world, right? I guess us being so rational.
Freud was pretty good at taking one and making it into
That's true.
a quote science. Huh?
Yeah, right.
Lately,
And Marx, I mean, Prometheus was the myth on which, he dedicated actually his dissertation to Prometheus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
do you know the two fish run into another fish going the other way, and the fish going one way says to the two fish, "Oh man, the water's great," and the other two fish go by, and one turns, looks at the other, and goes, "What's water?" In other words, like they're in it, they're in
right,
myth.
right.
That's why when he hears Girard talk about myth, he's kind of like, this is boring. But he, the water he's swimming in, the myths he's swimming in,
Yeah, called rationality.
he's just, just takes his
Sure.
second
Right.
nature, and it's, that's what I think, it's really the great thing, in terms of ideology of how it works, how you don't, people don't. Look at the Greek myths and they think, oh, that's myth, and I don't have that.
Yeah, no.
But of course, we're all inscribed in some set of beliefs that.
Well, look how we
Inflict an
tell
accent.
history. We tell history as the story of great men, rather than collective effort. So the Depression was solved by a great man, Roosevelt, coming along. And I mean, if you ask my brother, who got us out of the Depression, he would say, well, it was Roosevelt and WW2. Never mind the massive insurgency that was on the street for years. Never mind that he was a balanced budget Democrat until '38. but he
Should
saved
give
us.
Walker Evans photographs for Christmas. Let us now praise famous
Yeah.
men. No, that's all right. I'm just, not being cute here, but, in some ways it's true.
But I mean, I think that they're the myths that we promulgate and then the myths that we suppress. I mean, Woody Guthrie, sang about ordinary working people and tried to create a mythic status for migrants in the 30s, but
No, but I
that's all
That's
been
true. I
lost.
think what you're saying is very important, is the way it creates a framework, and then suddenly, like the fact that they call things entitlements, right?
Mhm.
It creates the sense that it's somehow a privilege, whereas if you created a context where it's a right,
Yes.
And you can't take it. It really changes things so profoundly.
But I think it's as much you can call it myth or you can just call it ideology, and that's the water that we swim in. For instance, that the New York Times is a neutral observer, rather than, like Adorno said in that wonderful essay, the ardent defender of what happens to be the case.
See, I think the Greek myths like that are for soldiers who were at the My Lai massacre, because they would understand it from their own experience of wartime and wartime gone berserk. I think those myths like that are for catharsis and psychological preparation for battle. I think they're very specific, function in a very specific way, but that's just me.
Oh, specifically, like, in particular? Or if it's good or not? No, that's a different question. Sorry.
No,
No, 'cause I thought like Aristotle, I'm like, well, the function of a
Catharsis.
tragedy
I'm
is
talking-
catharsis, and
I'm
that's how you
talking
know
more
it's good or
Right.
not, right?
psychological
You feel
In
the
Aristotle,
emotion.
right?
Yeah.
I'm not talking about like Aristotle's definition of catharsis. I haven't read Aristotle in decades.
And,
So,
no, I think, here's the thing, I think in terms of in terms of
The
Gramsci
term
and how-
catharsis, this is Gramsci, can be employed to indicate the passage from the purely economic or egotistic passional to the ethico-political moment.
Also, it's a movement.
That is the superior elaboration of the structure into the superstructure in the minds of men. This also means the passage from objective to subjective, from necessity to freedom. Structure
Oh,
ceases
no,
to
I
be
got
an
you.
external force anyway.
Yeah, the revolution
He's
cleans
very
shit
good
out.
about catharsis here. Yeah.
Where's
That's a
that?
redefinition.
This is in Gramsci, it's the term catharsis in the study of philosophy, page 366 in your edition.
Wait a second, I
Okay.
think I have that in my little edition.
But that's his he's redefining catharsis. At that
Yes,
point.
it's a redefined, but it's done as a collective will
Right.
instead of the individual who's expurged from pity
No,
and
and-
fear in
Yeah.
terms of identification. You suffer with Oedipus and all of a sudden
Yeah.
you're purged of these fears that
Yeah,
this
yeah,
will
yeah.
happen to you or
Right.
that,
Oh, it's interesting.
etc. It's a very different, this is much more of a collective. It's a very interesting, something again under theorized.
Yeah.
What is the role of catharsis in both the educational, agitational sense and as well in the, and elaborated in societal terms, right? The starting point for all philosophy of praxis, for all action, catharsis.
What note is that in the
This
study?
is the term catharsis, page 366, not in your edition, but I may be able to find it. It's not in the modern prints.
It's a
It's
very
in
short
and
section.
it's in the study of philosophy.
Yeah, I got
I think
that.
you have the study of philosophy?
Yeah,
Okay, it's later in the piece, a little bit further than individualism, theory and practice, structure and superstructure, and then there's a section called the term catharsis. Yeah.
That's interesting.
No, I mean, it becomes
Should
a
write on
much
that.
more, yeah.
Yeah, no, 'cause that's actually built into Fanon's work in terms of what
Oh, yeah.
decolonization is supposed to provide.
Absolutely.
Right,
Yeah,
what
yeah.
revolutionary violence does for you, right?
Absolutely.
No, and it does make sense. What is it that we're trying to do? We're trying to clean out the bad and start something new. Because, I mean, that's definitely, let's put it this, the end of this myth, right, is to
Right.
create this new world,
Right.
all right? Or spur the conditions for the possibility of that happening, right? So let's see here. Yeah, so the two big points he wants to draw out in terms of what the modern print should look like are that you have this figure, in this case it would be the party, that is dramatically, represented, giving you the content of the program of the party, right? That's easily identifiable for you could say for the average person. right? And then built into that content, especially because we're talking about revolution and a new world, there has to be moral and intellectual reform built into that, right? Which means to say something like, it's going to stand against what is out there as the dominant or sort of the hegemon at that point in time, right? So, in that sense, I think that's sort of the big deal of the modern prince, is sort of conveying a dramatic narrative that people can identify with in a passionate way that spurs them to the movement in some sense, getting their consents and developing the collective will of the people. And I guess this goes back, to what we're talking about. For me, in this, because I think in terms of examples, it's hard to think of an example on the left of how that would work out, right? And many of the points that we've already brought up have pointed to that already, right? And so in some sense, I guess this goes back to, thinking about how we're going to constitute ourselves, what that means and how we're going to go about doing that. And in some sense, and that just goes back to the cultural context when, our imagination is limited by this context that we live in, right? And it's unfortunate, yeah.
I don't know if this is worth discussing,
Yeah.
but for me, the myth of the founding documents, the sacred Constitution, to me, there's nothing at all sacred about the U.S. Constitution.
Oh, yeah.
It's about as sacred as the Bible, which is totally, they're arbitrary.
They're both territorial and very.
Arbitrary constructs. The guys who wrote it, half of them were slave owners, the other half were
Constituted on
merchant
slavery.
bankers. If you were a poor white male, you couldn't participate, and nobody else. People of color, the Native American, all women, they had to wait until 1920. I mean, what's sacred about it? It's the opposite of sacred. 1920, this country.
No, black women wouldn't have been voting until 65. And black,
The men could, I'm talking about women in general in this country couldn't vote until 1920, right?
Right.
In the Soviet Union, I think they put it in 1917. They gave it
Afghanistan,
3
even
years.
earlier.
3 years, right?
Afghanistan, because of British rule. I
Oh,
had
really?
some educational background.
And in
It's true.
Switzerland, only recently, a couple of decades ago.
Yeah.
Women of the world unite. You too have chains to break,
So I have a question for you.
not just workers.
Do you think we should change the constitution now, or should we modify,
Oh,
or
it's-
I don't know, because now we have like all these different identities that but it still correlates together. We still don't solve the problem, the structure problem. So
Everything about it is archaic and obsolete. Really. I mean, the Electoral College with Hillary winning 3 million more, that's a hell of a lot more, and she's not elected. And that happened over and over again. It happened with many, I think, recent elections. The popular vote did not count the Electoral College, which is a big capitalistic stratagem for controlling.
But
Right.
is your question, do we need to break into individual identities, or do we hold on to a heterodox narrative of emancipation that everyone in some way taps into, but nevertheless remains a kind of notion of a shared story, let's say myth, discourse of emancipation that carries different people, or does each identity, in a sense, so separate one from the other? Is that,
I feel that the Constitution is like a privilege for some, but not for others. So I don't know if we should count all identities, because also like the Constitution says citizenship, but not everybody applies for the citizenship. So it's also the same thing that we're talking about. What is it mean to be a citizen? So maybe that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
It's the whole notion of democracy. It's all constituted on slavery. I don't know how.
Yeah.
How can we even? It's not even a good option.
Yeah.
So yeah, we toss it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so a lighter. Yeah, and I think that's no. In terms of what Gramsci would say, I think we'd have to toss that. I don't know in what sense that would be helpful to us in terms of thinking about a future that's different from now.
Yeah.
All right, especially because, let's put it this way, and I think he points this out as well, is that the ruling class used that and built that to their favor, all right? And every time there's been a crisis, they've always used that to sort of try to get things back into an equilibrium, all right? So you can think of anything from like all those compromises they make in those amendments, right? Anything from the 3/5 compromise to the 14th Amendment, or what was it, the 13th Amendment is when they abolished slavery?
Yeah.
Right? All of that was amongst them. Why? They were dealing with crises, right? And in terms of that, they were trying to maintain the equilibrium of the system that they already developed, right? Now, here's the thing. It seems to me to be the case that, generally speaking, while we may be critical of it, it seems to have worked in terms of maintaining its status and its perpetuity, right? And I think that may be more of a case in terms of what Gramsci talks about in terms of it being bureaucratic. All right, it's not just a piece of paper, right? It's just not a leader. It's this whole apparatus that provides for the functioning of our government now, right? That is ossified, and he thinks that, in terms of what is the most conservative element, that's the most conservative element of the sort of system that we have. So we have we have the mass of people, we have the bureaucracy, and we have the heads of state, right? Yeah, and so you can think as the bureaucracy of sort of maintaining the legal mechanisms, being an apparatus for doing that. And so, yeah, in terms of the context of the United States, the myth is something like this, is that, oh, this document over here justifies us changing this to maintain the equilibrium. All right? Yeah. You don't like stating it that way, but that's, in terms of how Gramsci's framing it, I think that's fair. All right. Questions, concerns, issues, comments, anybody? All right, so in terms of the science of politics, I guess we'll just move on to that. All right, so you mentioned something. Okay, actually, all right, so he says the key innovation of Marxism is the idea that there's no human nature absolute in some sense, right? And so in that sense, that actually opens up our study of humans, not just the biology, but the history, right? And so he points out, at least in my edition, right, that at this point in time, let's see, 40. All right, so this is the first paragraph of the Science of Politics. All right, so it says Marxism, okay, so the fundamental innovation introduced by Marxism into the science of politics and history is the proof that there does not exist an abstract, fixed, and immutable human nature, but that human nature is the totality of human, historically determined social relations, that is, an historical fact, ascertainable within certain limits by the methods of philology and criticism. All right, so, now I think there's something really important to that in terms of what it means to be educated, right? Because it's the case that we don't have this human nature in this immutable sense, right? We're always in the process of being produced and reproduced, right? But that means it's the case that we could also change. So on that end, when thinking about education, we're not going to be focusing on these things about us that can't change, right? Or these qualities about us that are, essential to us in some sense. No, we have to, in terms of educating ourselves, take into consideration the conditions that we're in right now, right? And work from that, using that as the seeds of the future in some sense. So any questions about that? Comments?
Does that have to do with something called, I remember one of the terms, essentialism?
Yes.
Versus, what's the opposite of, essentialism means a human nature which is an an essence which is handed down in our, I don't know, cultural DNA, versus a human nature which is non-essential. I can't think of the other term. It's essential.
Well,
it's a philosophic
Constructive.
Well,
debate, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Essentialism versus whatever.
Yeah, constructivism, how do you want to frame it, right?
Constructivism,
Or it's
yeah.
like,
And also, consciousness, nature, as well,
Yeah.
too, and
Marx
is-
spoke of
is-
the
Is there
the
any such
species-
thing as human nature?
The species essence of man,
And-
that's okay. I mean, that's not essential.
Well, yeah, species being was because of the
Yeah, right,
evolutionary,
yeah, right.
models that,
But
from
not
Erasmus
essence
on.
in the theological sense.
Right, no.
yeah, no, it's sort of like the
That's,
thing
that's
that,
entirely arbitrary.
The thing is, for Sartre, for example, there's no such thing as human nature. There's only consciousness. Right?
I think Foucault.
There's no such thing as a
Foucault,
as a
too,
long
yeah, there's no human nature for
no
Foucault.
human nature in Foucault either.
I think.
For
No,
Marx,
no,
there's
no.
or the Marxists, if you will, it's determined by historically specific conditions.
By the evolution.
We're nature. We are conditioned by nature to go to cocktail parties in New York City and talk about rent. Or cost of accommodations, landlord-tenant relations, or what we can do. Yeah, exactly. So we're conditioned by that specific, historical moment. But he's I think in the beginning is arguing against the religious and transcendental notions of human nature, that somehow it's immutable, it's eternal, etc.
Yeah, and I think some of these Christian fundamentalists who vote for Trump, and their modus, I don't know, their moral mode, conduct.
Well, white
is so
supremacy is
different.
immutable, right?
I mean, it's so
it's
different
an immutable
from
category, right?
his lifestyle of doing. He's the ultimate opportunist.
Yeah.
He does whatever he needs to do, and these Christian fundamentalists who are antithetical in what they're supposed to stand for, they vote for him. Why?
Yeah. See, if you subscribe to that there is no such thing as human nature, then identity politics is thrown out the window completely, because you have absolutely no essential identity or whatever. It opens up a whole new field of things. If you subscribe to the fact that social relations and historicity determines human nature, you can also argue against identity politics, and this is part of a historical moment in which somehow this is playing out, that it's a new kind of consumerism, a new kind of regressive political tool in some ways. I mean, I'm not saying
Human
for
nature.
Fanon, when the fact of blackness is a very different kind of thing than identity politics. I mean,
Human nature reinvents
obviously.
itself.
that's describing relationships and
Right,
expectations in
exactly,
the world, right?
exactly. So,
Be your true self, Mike.
yeah. What's that?
Just be your true self.
Be your true self?
I
Yeah.
feel it.
Oh, yeah. I'm feeling like, I'm just doing it like Nike.
I didn't hear what you said.
It's a joke.
No, but here's the thing, like this idea of human nature, we play with it all the time, and it's part of our
Right.
sort of understanding of ourselves,
We
right?
say it spontaneously all the time. Human
Oh,
nature.
sure. So it's like, for example, right, like, students like to respond with, well, that's just human nature.
No.
Yeah.
That's just how we are.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, I guess that's just how we are.
That's what my father always told me, yeah. It's just my nature,
Yeah,
Michael.
that's what I can't help it.
That's
You're
not
stuck
an
with it.
answer.
Right, I'm
No,
stuck with this
terrible
answer.
Yeah.
Right? And I tell them, it's like, hey, you know what, if that was the answer to things, things would be so much easier. Right?
I feel
Because
like
there
we'll be more
we couldn't do anything about it then if that was really how it was the case, right? So what's interesting is this. So if it's the case that we can think of human beings as in the process of always being made, that means it's the case that the political party, in this case the leadership, has to be fully aware of that in terms of how they're going to develop their intellectual and moral reforms for the people. All right? And it's not, again, to reiterate this, it's not in the sense like people are naturally workers or X, Y, and Z, we have to frame our education this way. No, it's actually taking the historical context, thinking where they're at, considering, the level of production, all that kind of stuff, and thinking, well, what kind of people is it that we want to make, all right, and how are we going to make them, and what are the means to do such a thing, all right, and that itself is a program, all
But
right?
don't you think in reality, like, you know, if I want to make a politically interesting TV show,
Yeah.
I would have to, you know, we'd have to sit here and we'd have to talk about it in a certain way. Whereas if they're making, like, you know, if they're sitting out making something for dominant studios, something, they don't even, I don't think they sit there and go, in my experience, I mean, you know, they go, well, this will align with the dominant culture. You know, I mean, I just think.
But they're just so massively uneducated
Right.
that they can't escape the water. They're
Exactly.
just in the water.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Whereas if you want to do something, that takes effort. That takes, you know, a kind of conscious,
Right.
you know, thinking through to create something that's going to push another way.
No, and I got you, and that's I mean, that's one of the points he reiterates, is like, listen, you know, and I think he just takes this as a fundamental fact about politics, is there's leaders and there's the led, right?
And
it's-
there's the what?
there's the rulers and the ruled, there's the
Oh,
leaders
right.
and the people who are led, right? And it's incumbent upon the leaders to be aware of this about people, all right? And to sort of think, what is it, how are we going to educate these people in such a way that we make this kind of person that we want?
To go back to Machiavelli in the letter of dedication to the prince, he really has a very interesting moment, second to last paragraph, in which he talks about the dual perspective, that the prince must be of the people, like a painter. He draws an analogy to a painter that looks up from the hill to the mountain and also from the mountain down. So the prince must be, you know, both of the watchtower, to play on all along the watchtower, princes keep their view from the mountain, but at the same time must be of the people. And this is something that I think Gramsci is very well aware of, this dual perspective and this dual movement that is going on. It's almost like a dual power, you know, in terms of the old political notion of the sharing of dual power. You know, he's very, very, very careful on this. And you're right. I mean, you know, when you go to create something, you always have to think of the people and from the position of the creator, right, in a way. Whereas what you're saying is that the dominant media or the dominant, you know, producing of TV programs, films, etc., don't think this way at all. They just do the product. There's no thinking that goes on in
Right.
any
And-
sense, and no consciousness. Or
And if you brought
yeah,
up these
you know.
considerations, the room would go dead silent.
Of course.
They'd look at you.
What'd you say?
Yeah,
it.
you know,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they.
You can be like in
wouldn't be
David
there-
Lynch,
you wouldn't be there next
the mob guy with the coffee, he starts spitting it out, right? The
Right.
espresso. We researched it for 3 months. Yeah, it's a great sequence.
Here's the thing, I will say this, though, they may not talk like this, but it seems like the end product is pretty effective in getting
Well,
getting the
yes,
same
of course.
result.
It's a fascistic
Right?
model.
Uniformity of people,
Yeah, yeah.
consent, or
Yeah.
at least it seems like consent, right? The development of a general will.
But they're trying to replicate second nature. We're trying to change.
Yeah,
or
no, definitely. Definitely a big difference. But yeah, I think you're right. But again, the result is still the same in the end. It's like, wouldn't it be nice if we could develop something on the left like Fox News that like
Yeah.
cranked out like in lefties, right?
We call it line news. Like,
Exactly,
Machiavelli,
exactly.
the line news, yeah.
But again, it's like, we're not in the position like that. We're not the standard, not the hegemon in this case, right? We're
Right.
not the cultural influence. We're the ones who are, in a sense, revolting against that. All right, and that's why we have to be ultra conscientious, because it's super easy, and I think this is apparent in his work, and most anybody that studies trying to get out of these situations, is that it's going to be super easy to just repeat what we've gotten ourselves into in the first place.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing in terms of the history of creativity, and at least in my mind, is the U.S., the CPUSA. I mean, the great moments of creativity in some ways were the 50s. And during the 50s, you know, the party would always say, go work on Wall Street, make some money if you had a talent that way. Go work there if you had a talent that way. None of this is really operative anymore. From the New Left onwards, there was never any kind of, you know, movement into the superstructure, if you will, or really trying to move
no, it's
towards
a asceticism
infrastructure.
in some
And
sense, right?
in a sense, yeah. And where's the banks? You know, now we have People's Forum, but we don't know. I mean, we, you know, in a sense, where's the credit unions? Where are the things that people actually need to survive in Gaba, But back in the day, you could see this in the creativity, the collectivity that really formed. I mean, you go back and look at the books written, and another ogre in the room is, of course, the academicization of leftist thought, how it became just part of the academy, or what people call Marxism of the chair. It's no longer the armchair, but it's the Marxism of sitting in the chair. It's not even the armchair anymore in the universities. So I think this is a very interesting thing, and that materialist thinkers like Gramsci well aware of, and certainly the Machiavellian would be very, very important here too. I recommend reading The Prince. I love.
Yeah,
obviously, I love the book a lot. I mean, I recommend all 26 chapters.
It's a
It's
short
only
book.
73 pages.
It's a
little
It's a
book.
beautifully crafted book.
We did it with Bruno last time, right?
We did
We've done
some
it before,
parts
yeah.
of it.
Yeah.
Some parts
Yeah.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I
We did
remember that.
in Techniques of Servitude.
Or I'd have
Yeah.
been convinced.
Yeah.
Take it off the
Right,
bookshelf.
right. Well, and Althusser, and Gramsci too, he gets this from, the more I read of Gramsci, the more I see Althusser, how much he's lifted. Anyway, it's really a manifesto, The Prince. And this modern Princes could be read as well as a manifesto.
Yeah.
A more sophisticated analytic manifesto around concepts and stuff, but still a manifesto. This is, yeah.
Well, it's interesting, because that's what he says. I think he brings up the issue of the audience, right?
Yes.
So you mentioned that it had a lot of notoriety during this time.
Yeah.
Ill fame, being burnt.
Yeah.
And one of the things I heard, at least in gossip, was that, it was like for special people. It was like this esoteric thing that you would share amongst the... And that was some false thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
No,
that's
that's what Gramsci pointed out.
No, I mean, this was meant on behalf of the people. Machiavelli was incredibly subtle and clever. I mean, this wasn't, he was able to code so much in this
No,
text.
and that's
I mean,
the
this
point,
is
and
the
I guess that's
amazing
what
thing.
makes it
Yeah.
a nice model to understand it,
Yeah.
is that it wasn't for the initiated. It was intended for people
Right.
who had that sort of spirit to think, I've got a program, I want to triumph. Oh, here's the model to follow to possibly
Something like
pursue
that.
a program.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Um,
It's like Descartes with the discourse on the method. He didn't write it in Latin for the scholars. He wrote it in French so the people could pick up on deductive reasoning, right? I mean, this was an attempt to
That
get
was
it.
written in French. I
It was
wasn't
written in
sure.
French, yes.
Other
It was
thing-
not written
other
in
things
Latin.
he-
Everything else was in Latin.
Yeah.
But he wrote the method,
Which one?
the discourse on the method for rightly conducting one's reason
That one?
towards the
In the-
truth
in the vernacular.
in the vernacular. So, I mean, these guys they were very well aware of the church and the heretic burning. They're very well aware of what the power the state and the nobility had during this period. Yeah, very, very well
He had to
aware.
go to Amsterdam. I think he wrote a lot of his.
He
I
he
think
went to,
in
he
Amsterdam.
spent part of his time
A
in
lot of people
Amsterdam.
ran to Amsterdam.
Hobbes, yeah, Spinoza was
well,
thrown
yeah,
out.
of
Yeah,
course.
Yeah.
well, didn't he bury one of his books underneath his bed because he thought he would get excommunicated? He just left it there till he died.
Yes, Lemont.
Yeah.
Lemont.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Lemont. Yeah. Yeah, he learned from Galileo quickly. Yeah.
No, I had a really good teacher on Descartes.
Who was that?
Roger Ariev.
Oh, yeah, he's a scholar.
Yeah.
He was at Fordham.
Um,
Where was he? Where did you have him at?
I had known graduate school down at University of South Florida.
Oh, okay, yeah. He's a major player in terms of Descartes.
Yeah. No, I had
scholarship.
no
very
interest
good.
in Descartes. I was like, oh, you're the biggest guy in Descartes.
Yeah, he is. Yeah. He's one of the biggest. Yeah.
Yeah.
Martel Garou is the big guy.
Yeah.
Big
No,
guy.
but he
Which
knows-
he translated. Actually, Arou translated. Yeah.
Yeah, it was fun sitting in the class with him. All right, so thinking about politics, ruler and the ruled. Okay. This issue of the historical necessity of the party. All right. All right. So when he says, and this is, essay would this be the political party? I'm looking about halfway through.
Through the Prince. You talking about?
What page is that?
So I'm looking at the chapter called The Political Party.
Yeah, it's
Got
on,
it.
on page,
Yeah, 147.
page 147, yeah.
147.
Yeah,
In this book, 140?
yeah, 147, the
Oh.
political party.
Oh.
It has always been said, already been said, that the
Oh, right, that's what-
protagonist.
Elements of-
Totalitarian.
Yeah.
Oh, the political party, yeah.
I think we're all okay with that, right? Well, I think, here's the thing, I don't think, we usually associate totalitarianism with some negativity.
Right, it
but-
doesn't mean, right.
No, it means a total a program. Think of it as like a total understanding of things, right?
Mhm.
Of the world, of the future, how we're going to get there. All right.
I'm sorry, where's, oh, I see 88, the
148.
footnote, okay. Yeah, I'll embrace
But no,
it.
I think the bigger issue is the when is a party historically necessary? And he says he's claiming three things. All right. So the first is that the average person is down to participate in the. If I read this, tell me if I read this wrong, but he seemed to suggest that it was just based on this fervor and discipline.
And three elements.
Yeah, no, but the
Right,
first one
yeah.
is the average person,
The
they've
average
got this
person,
discipline
right,
and they have
right.
this fervor, they have a passion, right? They're
right.
pretty much ready to join a program,
Yeah, right.
right? So, the second, and he calls this the cohesive element. Right.
What paragraph?
Page 152, Richard, is
Thank
number
you.
one, a mass
then-
element,
Right,
and then a
right,
word,
right.
yeah, yeah.
All right, so the principal cohesive element, which centralizes in the national field, which renders effective and powerful the totality of the forces which left to themselves would count for nothing or very little. This element is endowed with a highly cohesive, centralizing, and disciplinary power, which is also, perhaps because of this, inventive. It is also true that this element alone would not form a party, but it would do so more than the first element. All right, so what he seems to be suggesting is that you have a leadership that has again, this total view, a program, right, and is able to bind and get to the people in some sense, right? And so the third element, and I guess this is where I was a little confused, right? A middle element, which links the first element with the second and puts them into contact, not only physically, but morally and intellectually. In fact, for every party there exists definite proportions between these three elements, and the greatest effectiveness is achieved when these definite proportions are realized. Given these conditions, one can say that a party cannot be destroyed by normal means, since if there necessarily exists a second element whose origin is tied to the existence of the objective material conditions, although in the dispersed and vague state. And if this second element does not exist at all, does not exist, all argument is pointless. Then the other two elements cannot help being formed. That is to say, the first element which necessarily forms the third, as it is a continuation and a means of expression. All right. So in some sense, this seems to be the content that they're spreading to the people, right? That brings them into the party, right? Now, in some sense, does that seem right? I guess that's my question. Does it seem like that's sufficient to provide for the necessity of a party?
Can you give me, could you formulate for example, or what's a?
All right, so you have people out there that seem hyped.
Critical mass,
Right, you got
the
like,
first condition.
yeah, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Then you have obviously leadership that has a cohesive plan. Then they have a means to deliver the plan, and the people join up.
Where does he mention the leadership?
this
I'm looking
is-
for the word leadership.
Well, isn't
It's-
it?
it's
Yeah, I
on-
know, because here's the thing, there's a centralizing force.
That's what he means
Yeah,
by
that's what I
leadership.
think he's getting at by
It
leadership.
could be a
'cause what's gonna
collective
bind- what-
leadership too, not just a single
No,
individual.
no, it could be a group, a cadre,
Yeah.
yeah, not just one person.
Yeah, he
leaders.
says one speaks of generals without an army, but in
That-
reality, it is easier to form an army than to form generals.
Exactly, so you
he's-
need this
he's
unit to
speaking
sort of
a
centralize
collective.
and sort of be able to take this mass and give them unification in some sense around a principle,
Right.
plan, program, what have you.
Right.
So, for example, the Tea Party.
Yes,
Would that be, could we say, there were all these people who felt disenchanted and they're
Disenfranchised.
disenfranchised,
really, yeah.
and there's a moment where they have I'm just trying to think about a historical example that we could
Oh, so for him, good historical examples of stuff like the Jacobins and the French Revolution,
That wasn't a party.
right?
They called
Because I
it.
think something like the Tea Party for him would be just a fraction of the Republican Party
Right.
that has been, I guess, incensed by something, and so the ruling class realizes that they need to have this disequilibrium, and so they're going to try to sort that out through means within the system to quell that problem, right?
So take the Jacobins
Yeah.
and
It was a
put it in
movement,
this framework. So that-
wasn't it?
What do you mean?
Well,
They have a plan, and they have their propaganda, and they're getting it to the
and they
people.
have the mass.
Well, they have the mass,
And
yeah,
they have
yeah.
the mass.
Yeah. So at that point in time, there's the people that are pissed, and he points that out. They're like, they were impoverished, they're hungry. You
they
have
have
this
a
group of
plan.
people that has a program, and they meet regularly to try to get this out, and that allowed for the process of the French Revolution.
Does obviously in the case of the French Revolution, it was a good plan, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a good plan, or does
No,
it?
that's the whole point for him, is that you could